This video is part of the Anatomy of a Spell series, in which I break down all of the components of a spell into individual topics and dive deeper into them. You can find the full playlist for this series in the description. This video is about the altar, which is the physical and symbolic space where a spell or ritual takes form. The altar is not a requirement for magic, but it is one of the most common ways that practitioners give their work structure, orientation, and presence in the physical world. So in this installment of the series, I will be breaking down what an altar actually is, and I will provide an overview of layout and design principles for creating your own. So let's define what an altar is. You can think of the altar as a stage. It is the place where the work happens and where the actions are performed. Just like on a stage, nothing is accidental. Where something is placed, when it appears, and how it interacts, it all matters. The same is true of an altar. Altars can be temporary or permanent. They can be highly structured or very simple. A windowsill, a table, the ground outside, or even just a section of your desk can function as an altar as long as it's used intentionally. So with that, we're going to start off discussing the altar, also known as the stage, where your tools and materials act out the play of the spell. That's how I like to think of the role of the altar in spellwork. It functions as an organizational tool for your mind and your body and your materials, and it also acts as a bit of a control panel. The altar is a dedicated surface that organizes space. It's a staging area. It lays out different boundaries, and it's the space in which you design your spell or your ritual. It's also a practical space to work with fire, water, smoke, different materials. Now, there are different types of altars. There are so many different types of altars depending upon the type of magic that you practice. But the outline that I'm going to be sharing today regarding the altar is grounded in widely shared ritual design principles found across Western occultism, folk magic, traditional witchcraft, and ritual theories. So this is just a general framework. Of course, this is not covering everything to do with an altar, but it's just a general idea, and you can take it and make it your own. So looking at different altar properties and types, you can have, to start off with, permanent versus temporary. That's a good starting place to think about. Both are valid, but that fully depends on what your living situation is and what your own preferences are. If you opt for a permanent altar, for instance, you have a wooden table or a mantle and it's always there. It's a space where you can build layered energy over time, and it's a dedicated space that you don't use for any other purpose other than to be your altar. On the other hand, a temporary altar would allow you more flexibility and portability. It also allows you more privacy if you have people coming in and out of your space that you don't want to share this with. It's a good idea to have something that you can set up and deconstruct simply. An example of that would be in my old place, I had a small black marble kitchen island. It was perfect to transform into an altar whenever I needed it. And the stone itself served as a natural base for anything that I was working with. And then when I was finished, I simply cleaned up my materials and it was just a regular kitchen island again. So both temporary and permanent, there's no one solution and they're both equally as valid. On that note, you may also want to consider the type of surface material for your altar. Wood absorbs and ages. Metal conducts energy. Stone is considered grounding. Glass would be considered neutral but reflective. So if you are interested in the materiality of an altar, then choose that material intentionally. But of course, if you're limited in what you're able to use, then don't worry about it. These are just additional layers of energy and meaning that you can invite in if you so choose. You may choose to define your altar by a specific altar cloth, which is a cloth that defines your working surface, and it can also serve to protect the surface or the furniture underneath from any water, fire, or wax that you're using. The cloth itself can take many different shapes, designs, forms that have their own meaning. So for example, the color of the cloth may signal correspondences. So you may use a black cloth for protection or absorbing. You may use green for growth or white for purity. There are also a lot of cloths that have diagrams printed onto them. So you may have a cloth that has a zodiac wheel on it, and you then layer your tarot cards over that. Some altar cloths have the flower of life or other geometrical patterns onto them. Pentagrams, moon phases, directions, symbols, sigils, all of these print-ons can be used to place and orient your items on top of your altar. So if you are interested in using an altar cloth, you can simply just have your altar be wherever you lay out that piece of cloth. So now let's go over some basic geometry and layout principles of an altar. And again, you can always set up your altar any way that you want, but if you don't have a starting point, these are some good guidelines. So think of your altar as having a focal point. This is going to be your visual center, where you'll have either a statue, a sigil, a candle, or something that the eye returns to. And then everything else, all the other tools and materials that you're using are going to orbit this anchor or this focal object. Now we'll have more on focal objects later, but this is one way to orient your altar. Another layer of geometry that you can place on top of your altar would be the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west, and then placing objects and materials according to these directions. So in most Western occultism, east represents air and intuition, south represents fire and action, west, water and emotion, and then north, earth and stability. And then you can use these directions to place your tools, your elements, any invocations. So an example of this would be placing your incense towards the east of the altar, a candle at the south, a chalice or a cup of water towards the west, and a bowl of salt in the north. Now, similar to using the cardinal directions to place tools and materials, would be to consider elemental placement. So when you're thinking of elemental placement, you're going to want to divide up your tools into the different concepts of earth, air, fire, and water. Earth being grounding and stability, air being thought, inspiration, intuition, and language, fire being will, action, ignition, destruction, transformation, and water being about emotions, healings, the subconscious, flow. And then using that logic to place and use your tools together. And I'm not saying that everything earth has to be in one spot and everything air has to be in another spot. Just simply keeping in mind when you're placing things, what they represent and how they interact with each other, and using that as a guiding force. Another way to think about the geometry of your altar is to consider symmetry versus asymmetry in layout. Symmetrical arrangements invite equilibrium. They are very kind of formal in their structure and in the way that they come across. It represents stability, and it's very common in ceremonial magic. On the other hand, an asymmetrical layout can invite a more unique narrative, something that flows more specifically to what you want. And it's very useful in spellwork that's meant to move or force change. And we see a lot of asymmetrical layouts in folk and hoodoo magic as well. Another way to mentally divide up the space in your altar is to think in terms of verticality. So think of this, like if we're thinking of this altar as this stage, this scene that we're setting up with all of these different actors and these different players, we can think of the top area vertically as like the upper world, and then we have a middle world, and then against the surface of the altar would be your ground or your lower world. So when you're thinking of your workspace as having these three levels, the upper level would be anything that reaches most upward. That would be tall candles, incense smoke, maybe raised statues, or any items that are hanging from the ceiling. You can think of these items as connecting to the higher realm, which would represent guidance, blessing, inspiration, and anything that you're calling down into the work. The middle level would be anything between this higher level and the surface, so essentially most of what you have. And this would be the realm of action and creation, and this is where most of the shaping of the spell happens. And then you can think of the lower level as the grounding layer. So this would be stones, salt bowls, iron, cauldrons, anything heavy or placed low. And these would be tools that stabilize the work, anchor it, or send energy down to manifest. And you can play with these ideas of the three levels as you see fit. That's just one example, but it's just another way to orient your space or to think of your altar as a scene, a stage play that you're setting up is going to then enact and bring what you want into fruition. So with all this in mind, here are some visual examples of different altar types. So a Golden Dawn temple layout might use very precise directional attributions, or a Green Witch altar might lean less formal and more seasonally arranged. Wiccan mantle altars often include a pentacle, chalice, and candles aligned with Sabbath energy. A hoodoo altar may include rootwork jars. You may see graveyard dirt, coins, offerings, personal items, photos of ancestors or specific saints. Shamanic shrines may have stacked shelves. They're often vertical in orientation. They may have offerings such as bones and items from the land. Christian and Catholic altars definitely make a lot of use of directionality, horizontality, verticality, and almost always the crucifix is the focal point of the altar. So some notes on when you're building an altar. Don't worry about negative space. Negative space is a good thing. You don't want to overfill, especially if you're working with oils or candles. Space itself is a component, so leave breathing room so that the eye and the attention can move. Again, think of the altar as a stage play. Your tools and your materials are the actors within that space. And then not to nag, we're all adults here, but do think about fire safety. If you are using oil and fire or flammable materials in a small space, just keep in mind how you're using those things together. And if you are doing something potentially risky, at least have a fire extinguisher nearby. So with that, I'm going to leave you with some altar inspiration images. Take note of how varied these altars are. Some seem to follow traditional rules, others make their own rules. Think of the altar as your own space of ritual self-expression and have fun with however you decide to construct it. The next videos will be about the tools and materials that get used within the altar space, so look out for that. If you enjoy this content and want to see more, like the video and subscribe to the Magick Lab for esoteric deep dives, applied spellcraft, and self-empowerment through ritual and magic. Thank you for watching.